Welcome to Homeroom with Education Leaders. Very excited to have you all here with us today. We've got some people trickling in from the waiting room, so we're going to give people a few minutes to log in and get settled, and we'll get started about 3 minutes after the hour. Just as a note, if you have any questions as you're kind of coming in, feel free to submit them into the Q&A, and we'll have plenty of time towards the end of the webinar to answer those questions. So I'm looking forward to the conversation, and we'll get started in just a couple minutes. Good afternoon, everyone. If you're just joining us, welcome to Homeroom with Education Leaders. We're just giving people a couple minutes to log in. We will get started at 3:03 Eastern, so just 2 more minutes. Thanks. Okay, everyone, it is 3:02. I know there's still lots of people coming in and are going to be joining us throughout, and so want to get started and get through as much of the conversation as possible. I'm really excited for today's conversation, not just because I think it's going to be a really great one, but also Secretary Revel was my teacher, my professor in grad school, so very excited about that. So for those of you who haven't joined us in the past, my name is Julia Cunningham. I am the Deputy Director of State Engagement here at the Hunt Institute. Welcome to the Homeroom with Education Leaders webinar series. So today we have 3 really great guests with us. We have Elsie Arnson, who is the Superintendent of Public Instruction in Montana, Dr. Rupak Gandhi, who is the Superintendent of Fargo Public Schools in North Dakota, and Secretary Paul Revel, who is the former Secretary of Education in Massachusetts and currently is the founder and director of the Education Redesign Lab at Harvard Graduate School of Education. So we're going to talk today about community partnerships and what that looks like at the state and local level. And if you'd like to follow along, we will be putting some social media together on our Twitter page, Hunt_Institute. You can also follow along using the hashtag #EdHomeroom. So please feel free to use those, and we'll be checking in throughout. We would love to hear questions from all of you, so we'll have a good chunk of time towards the end of today's webinar to jump into some questions from the audience and really kind of get into this conversation a bit more. If you have questions that pop up throughout, please make sure to submit them into the Q&A, and we will devote plenty of time there at the end to really get to all of those. So with that being said, really want to leave as much time as possible for our discussion. And so I'm just going to jump right in. And we are going to start and kind of get a good overview from Paul here and talk a bit about what we're really talking about here. So Paul, could you, from a more national perspective, talk about what do we mean when we're talking about these community partnerships? What do they look like? And what are some supports that are needed at the state and local levels to really make them possible?
Okay, I'd be delighted to. Thank you, Julia. Nice to see you again and see you out in the world making a difference. Nice to be with all of you in the audience and my fellow panelists, many of you leading education at this crucial juncture, and that service is very much appreciated. I'm going to take sort of a broad view and come back around to the question that Julia raised about partnerships. But right now, I don't need to tell you, but let's just sort of take a snapshot of where we are. It's a time of great need. It's been a time of suffering. It's a time of death and loss, and grieving. At the same time, it's a time of opportunity. There are opportunities for some kinds of changes. It is as though we've been hit by an earthquake here in our society, and that earthquake has shaken everything up, knocked us down, caused us to get up, brush ourselves off, reconnect with one another, and start to think about restoring some form of normalcy and possibly even building toward a better future. One of the things that we first notice when we go through this exercise is an earthquake generates a tidal wave, and the tidal wave shows us on the ocean floor the lives of the people that we're serving in public education, and particularly those at the bottom who are most disadvantaged, and for whom the general public assumes schools were taking care of basic needs like health and nutrition and mental health and stability and things of this nature. And when that tidal wave pulled back after this earthquake of COVID, it was revealed that the realities of those lives were so profound and so differential that the prospect that schools by themselves could fill all those needs was never really on. Schools tried the best they could to patch and to support and to be compassionate, but we didn't really have a system that was designed to guarantee that every child comes to school each and every day healthy and ready to learn. So this is where the opportunity lies, I think. There's an opportunity for some transformational change. I call it a Sputnik moment. And there are several areas where we've seen it already, the use of technology in our field, all kinds of partnerships associated with that. Partnerships with family engagement. Many school districts have bent over backwards during the pandemic and the school closings to reach out to families. Personalization, customizing support to students, about which I'll say a word more later. And applied learning, going more deeply into applying the resources in our community, both human resources and projects and problems that need to be solved as part of the curriculum. So we have an opportunity, and I think this boils down to leadership. The window of opportunity is open, and leaders, transformational leaders, will know what to try and move through the window at this delicate time when people in the field are exhausted and they're at some level of overload. On the other hand, many have made the first step toward change, and that's always the first step to take. It's also an opportunity because of the tremendous resources that the federal government has made available to us that enable us to do some transformational changes without having to cut back programs and services that the public, that our students and their families and our teachers are accustomed to. So we have an opportunity to take now a more holistic view on what it would take to build a child development and education system that truly met every child where he or she was in early childhood, and give them what they need inside as well as outside of school in order to be successful, in order to have a fair shot at joining the middle class. So there's this holistic view would dictate that we bring together formal partnerships in local communities and at the state level called children's cabinets. And we at the Ed Redesign Lab have worked hard on, with many communities around the country, on putting together children's cabinets, which is a group of people usually convened under the leadership of a mayor, sometimes under a superintendent or a business or university leader, community-based leader, bringing together all the people who are concerned about children's welfare in the community, about their success in education and in life, and begin to work on gathering necessary data to build a cradle to career pipeline that wraps services and supports and opportunities around our mainstream education system. Children spend only 20% of their waking hours in school, 80% of their waking hours outside of school, And it will take, and I think we've proved this well before the pandemic, it's going to take a whole community to get to our aspiration of no child left behind or every student succeeds. And that can only be done through collaborative action and the kind of partnerships that a children's cabinet can make possible in a local community. So I'd be happy to talk more about that later. So I'll stop there, Julia, as a way of putting a few cards on the table.
No, that's really helpful. Thank you so much for kind of setting the stage there. And I think gives us a really good jumping off point to kind of get into some of the details of what this is looking like in states and districts and schools and local levels around the country. So Superintendent Arntzen, would love to hear from you and about what you all are thinking about in Montana around this topic. And I know you have a couple just points that you wanted to share via slide, but to lend that specific Montana context. But thinking about what's going on in Montana and what your priorities are, how are you all approaching this question?
Thank you very much, Julia. And Paul, you're spot on. It is about community. And in a very large geographic state as Montana, the fourth largest in our lower 48, it is so important for connection. Yes, we do have interstate connection, and we are landlocked, and we have one of the largest borders with Canada. If we could go to the next slide, please. So we are small, very large, but small, 145,000, 150,000 students pretty much. And we have a lot of schools and a lot of districts. One of the things that I know from my life, fourth generation in Montana, I was also a legislator, so really understanding the policies in Montana that surround education, that we embrace our very rural schools. Majority of our schools are 50 students or less. One size does not fit all. One community does not look the same as another community. Agriculture is our #1 industry. We have very little diversity, but it doesn't mean we have no adversity. We do. When I come back to the one size doesn't fit all, especially in federal policy, it's the very same when we craft local policies from our school boards all the way up to our state and our laws that govern schools. So we are very, very, we're very unified racially across our state. Next slide, please. But there's also in rural Montana, there's poverty. And poverty doesn't necessarily mean that there is a disparity of education or of any other forms that come into our rural communities. I know I was told I was impoverished when I was a child. I didn't know or recognize that I was. I think we're in the day and the age right now where recognition is happening at a lower age, where more people are recognizing difference, whether it isn't a difference of social economical or difference vastly in geographical, because we have become more connected through internet and other things as well. Next slide, please. One of the things that I was very pleased as a state senator that we ushered in transformational learning. Transformational learning is only in about 25% of our school population at this time. It's challenging that we have to incentivize uniqueness, that we have to incentivize innovation. But we did that, of course, through dollars, but also through flexibilities. I'm an elected chief, which means that I want this job. And my purpose after 32 years, and I am governed by a political party, my purpose was to disrupt. And then lo and behold, the Lord gave us COVID. So the disruption came naturally. So my purpose has been to keep the politics at bay, to allow innovation to occur naturally as much as with some incentive, a very small incentive. And we are very large geographically, like I said, but a lot of the small schools embrace this, even though they could, because the policies that we have that govern our schools, both in financial and in any other safe and healthy manner, and also by our local school boards, those policies are flexible enough to offer here. Next slide, please. There's a lot more information that we have. And this concludes my discussion here on the PowerPoint. But what I do want to add from a state perspective is that there is so much more that a state can do to offer flexibility rather than confining innovation. And if we have a relationship, or if we want more communication to other partners that we may not even know are there, we have to allow more flexibility. It can't be by a constraint of how we communicate, the manner we communicate. It has to be seeking unique opportunities. In Montana, we seek international, as well as we seek our local, and of course, our very rural partners. By the federal designation, we're a frontier state. That means we're a maverick still. That means that we can still think outside of that traditional school box. That's been my role as a state superintendent, to give more authority to local boards, to give more authority to parents, and to give more opportunities for our Montana students.
Thank you so much, Superintendent, and really excited now to kind of keep moving down that, moving across that chain and think about what this looks like for people who are in the district and are really, doing this work day in and day out, and what that ends up coming out as. And so we have Superintendent Rupak Gandhi, who is the superintendent of Fargo Public Schools in North Dakota. And so Superintendent, would love to hear a bit about what your district is thinking about when it comes to community partnerships, and really what supports you all are prioritizing as you think through this.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you to the Hunt Institute for having us, and I appreciate the perspective of being able to start from a macro level and drill down to each school district and the unique needs as we address community partnership within our school district. I think over the last 18 plus months, if the pandemic has taught us anything, is that we've always known this, but it takes a village to raise students and to raise children. However, even when you look at the village people, you have to understand that there's different sets of expertise and different roles that each individual plays. And I think part of that is not just community partnerships, but it's community education. And I think providing our community with the tools to be educated on how each other can use their expertise to support one another is where we're going to see the greatest amount of success. So where we are in Fargo Public Schools is that we focus a lot on making sure that we spend a significant time up front educating our community on how they can be strategic partners with the school district. Over the last couple of years, we have engaged in some learning with our community, and that a lot of that's focused around mental health. A lot of that's focused around social emotional learning, and a lot of that's focused around changing up, looking at equity measures and changing up punitive and institutional disciplinary practices within our schools. So we, as a school district, we don't just focus first on implementing restorative justice practices or restorative practices across our school districts without making sure that we spend a significant time educating our community on what does that mean. We are firm believers in Simon Sinek's Start with the Why, and then also firm believers in saying and understanding that we always start with the premise of goodwill, and we don't ever believe that parents or partners don't want to do good to support the schools. It's they don't know what to do. And so what can we do as a school district to teach them those things? So that's incredibly important for us as well. The other thing that's really important for us as a school district is also to teach our community about the role of governance within a school system. Over the last several years, and the last 2 years specifically, there has been increased community engagement, whether it's at a district administration level, whether it's at a school administration level, or whether it's at a school board level. Understanding the role that governance plays and what decisions a school board can make versus what decisions superintendent or the administration of a district can make versus what decisions a building level administrator can make is critically important to our community, so they understand the processes that we utilize to move a district moving forward. And respecting those structures that are in place allows us to be concentrated and strategic in terms of what we do.
Thank you so much, and your a lot of questions are springing to mind as we're talking about this. I'm really excited to dig in a little bit more. Just want to remind everyone who is attending, we have a Q&A open, so please feel free to drop any questions you have into the Q&A. We're going to have plenty of time to really get into some of those, but I do have some that are coming to mind right away and that we have to kind of get us going. So I'm going to start with Paul again. And Paul, how can states really work to bring communities and schools together in a meaningful way? And what supports can really be offered there? And can you speak about some examples that you've seen in communities that you've worked with where this has been successful?
Well, I think the state can play an important leadership role in just naming the problem. In other words, given what we've just been through and the phenomenon that I talked about earlier about a reveal for lots of members of our society that the needs of children are profound and go far beyond the limited amount of time they spend in school. States can use their bully pulpit power, either from the governor's office or from the legislature and the education commissioner, to say, you know, this is a holistic problem. This is about child development as well as about education. And communities have to come together to do work on this. So one obvious way that this could happen up front, we did it in Massachusetts way back in Race to the Top, was to create some incentive money at the state level that's available on a granting basis to local communities to form children's cabinets, to form bodies, whatever you want to call them. I mean, we give them the name children's cabinets, but collections of leaders in a community who all share a concern for children's welfare and development, who believe that our community cannot be successful unless our children are successful, our economy won't work, our democracy won't work, and the schools can't do it by themselves. Schools alone are not enough to do the job. I think we've proved that through 25, 30 years of education reform, that schools are necessary, they're important, we can do a lot better with the money that we have, but it's going to take a much broader set of interventions and attention to the lives of children overall if we expect to leave no child behind. So in places where we've seen it work, for example, it can be as basic as, you know, putting up a Facebook bulletin board to list needs that students and families have and other community members can meet. Or it can be as complex as advocacy work, where a children's cabinet gets together and isn't talking about programs and services so much as advocating for policies at the state level and at the national level, for that matter, that will provide, for example, more money for mental health services. We've seen that kind of thing happen. We've seen the children's cabinets play a powerful organizing role in response to the pandemic, helping the community come together to fill in the gaps in this cradle to career pipeline for students. And then finally, you know, the bringing together of leaders in a community to broadly recognize that this goes beyond simply what we can do in the schools, but it's what we can do in a community, and that we need to personalize. We've been working with the city of Nashville, who now has 60,000 students, each with a navigator assigned by the school system, a teacher, administrator, or even some third parties, 6,000 people acting as navigators to personalize education. In other words, to not pretend as though everybody's pandemic experience has been the same, but actually to say, as you come back to school, we know your experiences have been widely different. There were already big differences in our education cohorts. Now they've gotten bigger. And what are we going to do individually to see you, hear you, talk to your family, respond to your needs, and bring you back in, much in the way we would in a medical system. We do a diagnosis, and then we have a prescription rather than batch processing or the sort of factory model of education. So those are a few examples of the kinds of things that I think can happen.
Thank you. And it kind of leads me into my next question for Superintendent Arntzen. And, you know, we see in a lot of communities, particularly lower income communities or communities with high populations of students of color, this kind of distrust between the community and the school system very often. And just wondering kind of what can states do to really kind of build that trust and help support that relationship. And, I think, as Paul said, naming the problem and being that support is really important. And how can you really come in and also kind of help repair that relationship? And also, there's so much funding coming in from these COVID relief funds. Maybe how can some of that be used to support some of that work as well?
Thank you, Julia. And I'm going to come back with what Paul said about the reveal. I think it's very important and it's imperative that government has responsibility and ownership over that reveal. We could push and kick the can down the road and say, well, it's this problem, and it's this problem. But if you don't rip it back and say, this is the problem, and then you focus systemically on what that can be and what you believe it can be, then your resources have no avail. And, that's one of the things that I have realized in my position, that it is extremely important at the state government level that I don't have our agency and our resources siloed, but our agency has flattened over the period of time in the last 4 years of leadership here to be able to say that we all work together on this. 11% of our population are tribal students. And we have 9 tribes that we honor in our state with 7 reservations. And we in our Montana Constitution have Indian education for all. We're the only state that really has embraced our historic first inhabitants of our state in our Constitution. And we honor that every day. So in the state standards that I have, we have put every single moment when a child enters into public school to the time that they cross that stage and get that honorary degree, that they are recognizing our first Montanans. But not only that, we instituted a consultation process in our agency where we have a discussion, a conversation with government to a sovereign nation of our tribes. That consultation process is also very unique across the United States. This is not government doing things to people, to a group of a sovereign nation, but working with to really peel back what the challenges are, how we can embrace, and in a term, wrap around government services to enhance student life, student ability, student success. And I think that's one of the things that government can do even more. But owning the problem, not kicking the can down the road, and being responsible, I believe, is probably the number one thing that then can open up the door to that conversation more deeply on trust.
Thank you. And this, once again, really, I think ties really nicely into my next question for Superintendent Gandhi. We have heard very consistently through, well, forever, but also over the past 18 months that parents and teachers are just at capacity. And, that's a real challenge. And they are, struggling to get the duties that they have done to begin with. And so how can we think about really supporting this work while also making sure that we're not asking too much of people who are already doing so much for students? And Superintendent Gandhi, would love to hear if you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think it's absolutely essential that we start with defining what short and long-term goals are and making sure that all the patrons and stakeholders for your system are aligned on your measures of success. Equity work within public school districts across the nation has become a key focus, as it should be, over the past several years. So has been incorporation of providing mental health supports to our students. However, those two things in itself are huge umbrella terms, and they can mean very different things to very different individuals. When a superintendent in a school district might say, I'm doing some equity work, they might be focusing on the marginalization of young men of color who are being suspended in their school district at a disproportionate amount. Whereas another superintendent might be focusing on the over-identification of young men of color or young females of color in special education, right? Different people have different goals. So I think it's really important to, just like we do in the continuous improvement process or the growth of our employees, is to chunk short-term and long-term goals and make sure that there's alignment with that. And to bring your community on board and say, and always recognize the fact that we're not trying to reach an end state in education. We're not trying to reach an end state in any particular work that we're doing, because education is always going to have a component of human interaction, and there's always going to be continuous improvement. Unfortunately, the nature of the game is that we're going to get results where we put our time and effort, but resources, time, and effort are all finite. So there might be a group of students that we can catch up and focus on equity work now. 20 years from now, we might have recognized that our practice and our focus on this group of students left another group behind. And that's where we have to adjust and always look back and say, who are we not providing that equitable education for across the board in that moment in time, and who do we need to focus on? Because our goal is to serve all students. So understanding that this is going to be a process, and the only way to be able to manage that process, given the limitations that we have and everything else that's going on, as referenced earlier, with all the expectations that are put onto educators across all systems, is to make sure that we're aligned on what our short and long-term goals are as well. I think it's also important to have a very clear conversation around what is the expectation for a school district or a school system. Oftentimes, when we look at public or even private schools, there are two competing interests. One is outcomes, which is the measures that we use for student achievement and the outcomes that our students are producing, which are critically important. But oftentimes, although that might be the vision of the Board of Education, the administration, the staff of a school district, the community expectation might be an experience, because those are members of the community that have gone through the same school system. They've participated in a certain experience, whether it's based on class size, whether it's based on programming that's offered in the school district, and they want to see that those things can continue within the programs that you offer as a district as well. So if you're talking about, okay, I only want to improve outcomes by double blocking math and reading, but it comes at the cost of a music program that's been an institution in your school district, then you need to have that conversation with the community and saying resources are finite, our funds are finite. What is it that you want to see when we see our students graduate from our school districts? Is it the outcome measured by X, and we need to be aligned on what X is, or is it the experience that you once said? Both have equal value, both are extremely important. It's a matter of what we want to do. And without that alignment, I think everyone's going to have different expectations for one another. And you're always going to see systems not being successful or being criticized because everyone's expecting different outcomes for what you're producing.
Thank you. And I think that's such a great point about just recognizing that just the continuous process that this work involves, and that you're always going to have to come back and really reevaluate your goals. And that leads me into my next question, which I actually would love to hear from all three of you on what your thoughts are here. It's been brought up a couple times, really building the capacity of community members and family members to really know what we're talking about when we're talking about these goals and talking about what we're trying to achieve. And I was wondering if you could address some of the need for really building school boards' capacities and really engaging them as partners in this work, and how can school boards really be brought in and equipped with the tools that they need to partner with those who are working in the community and really kind of strengthen this work. And so would love to hear from all three of you. I don't know if anyone has any urgent thoughts they want to get off their mind, but if not, we can start with Superintendent Hartson.
Thank you very much, Julia. I firmly believe that the landscape that we have right now cannot be an us versus them scenario. It can't be a loud, robust discussion at the microphone in a boardroom that gets nowhere over Zoom, or is a challenge, or name calling from associations or request for law enforcement or any of those. That is divisive, and that doesn't move anyone forward, let alone put the actionable onto student success. So looking forward is where we are, looking forward. So at the state level, we are very blessed to use some of the COVID dollars, these precious congressional tax dollars, to be able to open up a leadership academy that we are training, that we are educating, that we are allowing an open form of communication for our locally elected school boards. As I said, we're very, very rural, and we have school boards of 3 people. We have school boards of multiple based on the population that they come from. And that diversity across our state is something that we want to celebrate, but we also want to put the focus on our students and making sure that our students are there. The other aspect is in medical terminology in Montana, as I said, we're very frontier. We have engaged many, many times with the Montana Association of Pediatrics, wanting to make sure that that health and wellness is there as well in a very telemedicine for our trustees to understand, as well as our parents, so that we can embrace and get to the root of a solution and not so much be challenged about all the different arguments or difficulties that might be there. We all try to agree on something and then move forward with a solution for that.
Yeah, and that's a great flag on the Montana Leadership Academy. I'll say I've had some requests from other policymakers about building school board capacity, so it's great to know that I have something to point them towards now. Secretary Rebel, Superintendent Gandhi, anything that you'd like to add there?
I think that the school boards are the connective tissue between the school department and the community. They're the forward-facing, community-facing arm of our effort in education. So I think they've got a leadership role in terms, again, of defining the problem as more than just a school problem, but it's a community problem, of showing an openness to partnership and engaging with others in the work. We don't want a fortress school department insulated from the community, but we want one fully engaged with the community. They have 2 big jobs, I think, vis-a-vis the kinds of things we've been talking about here today. One is to build trust. The topic has come up frequently and did in one of your earlier questions. We've got a crisis of trust going on across the nation now at various levels of government. And the only way to overcome that, it seems to me, is through relationships. We trust people with whom we're in relationship. And you don't get into relationship unless we build structures, we create opportunities for people to come together and to listen to one another, to try and understand where people are coming from, even if their views are different than your own, to develop a little political empathy. And I think school boards can create forums about education, which shouldn't be, as Elsie said, shouting matches of one ideology versus another, but an attempt to understand what the respective concerns of different parties are. And how do you find the middle? How do you come together? How do you assume everybody has good faith and good intentions? They just have a different set of strategies in terms of what they think is the best approach to getting there. So I think school boards can create that atmosphere and those structures in a community. And if they do that, they then draw people in. I mean, no parent likes anything better than to feel that the parent and the teacher are in collaboration for the success of the student. That's what people want to feel in their families at the ground level. So if we create the opportunities for people to listen to one another and build relationships, we then build the capacity of the school system to solve the kinds of problems that we're talking about, because we've got more partners starting with our families.
What I would say is that based on my personal experiences and the research conducted in my dissertation, the biggest way to develop school board capacity is to establish a strong governance structure that is universally known to the administration of that organization and to the school board. This is a double-edged sword, what I'm about to say, but school boards are very unique compared to many industries in the private sector that have a board, because more often than not, board members are not individuals that have that same experience in that field, whether it's through school or district leadership. I think there's good and bad for that. The good is that those members represent the values of the community. They know the expectations of the community, which I've alluded to before. And the bad piece about that is, unfortunately, they don't have the experience or the training or education oftentimes that have gone through individuals that have been in positions of school and district leadership. And I think both of those are critical components, but they have to be married together in a delicate balance. And school board members are able to provide that. They're able to provide that when they know what the expectations are for their role as a school board and what their expectations are for the administrative staff that they are governing. And being able to allow that clear governance structure will allow your board to develop in a way of education, because if they want to get information, whether it's responding to a constituent, whether it's based on concerns that they're hearing, that might be more operational in nature, they're naturally going to have a tendency to go and seek that from their own staff, who can provide deeper context and really allow for more information to be shared. That allows for a structure that it doesn't allow school board members to respond immediately just based on things that they're hearing in the community without further due diligence, right? Our school board members are overwhelmingly underpaid, and if they're paid at all. And they have a very important job in the community while they're also balancing their own families and their own careers. So it's integral that we continue to support them. And I think some of this has been backed up with the Lighthouse study out of Idaho that shows the impact of school board leadership on student achievement, but also talks about that has to be with a narrow focus in terms of what the school boards are asked to do. And having a governance structure allows to do that. The second piece is board education. Board meetings are a wonderful opportunity, not only for the board to make decisions, but to hear from staff, hear from teachers, and hear from community members and parents about what is going well, what is working, and what is not working. And providing that ongoing opportunity for education and question and answer, it's going to be very important to board development.
Yeah, I think those are such great points, and I really like the comparison to the corporate board structure, because really, I'm just thinking back to my own teaching experience and the school board members that were in my community where I taught, and many of them, had GEDs and didn't feel like they had the confidence, or they didn't have the confidence that they were kind of equipped to make those decisions, even though they totally knew what they were talking about. It was just kind of building up that power empowerment and making sure that they felt like they really had a voice at the table that I think really kind of led to the strong relationship between our administration and our school board. So thank you for that point. It's a really great one. My next question, I wanted to ask a little bit, kind of going back to this corporate board discussion, I wanted to ask a little bit about private partnerships here and what role they play, and particularly thinking about, Superintendent Arntzen and Superintendent Gandhi being in more rural states, although I know Fargo isn't necessarily as rural, but it's not Boston. And so really thinking about in rural states and rural communities, how can you build up those private partnerships? And then Secretary Revel thinking about, really what role they play in these kind of full community wraparound services. So once again, would love to hear from all three of you.
So let me start from a rural state perspective. As I had mentioned earlier, agriculture is our #1 industry. But of course, as the global economy is at risk, we are also diversifying, and we've become quite a tech state. So does that mean then that my 11 teaching and learning standards at the state level needs to be quickly shifted? I believe government needs to be a little bit more nimble. It does mean that there's more flexibility that is needed to recognize the current need structure, whether it is for employment purposes or whether it is not. I have 4 initiatives at the state level, and it starts with mental health and a whole being of a child with Montana Hope, and it ends all the way with Montana Ready. And that Montana Ready is what ensures that partnership, not just with the agriculture and the tech that's inside a combine at this point, but it's also about allowing a student, if they choose to go to college, of course, if they choose otherwise, it needs to be another venue that we can allow in a community that's very, very rural. So personalized learning, Paul, you spoke about that. We're all in on personalized learning, and that does put a lot more on an educator's plate. I license about 20,000 educators across our state. That means that our licensing system needs to be a little bit more nimble, more fluid, and recognize the capability of a teacher that may have expertise that may not be in that current brick and mortar process that we have right now. If I'm going to grow education for a 10-year period, and looking at partnerships that are outside of Montana's borders, or look outside an agriculturally based economy, I need to think that that teacher that I'm creating as well in our 10 teacher prep programs across our university setting in Montana, and that we have reciprocity with all the other institutions that create teachers. But I believe it's a partnership from the beginning. It's a creation, making sure that we have a goal that's not just now, but more so into the future. Because we are creating entrepreneurs right now that we are also creating jobs for. So, for my grandchildren that are in elementary school right now, I want them to be well-versed and to be well-ready, Montana ready, as they exit the public school system. But we have to have that partnership in government as well as in the private sector in order for that nimbleness to be very proactive moving forward.
I think one of my colleague panelists, and I think both of them earlier talked about the importance of understanding how much is being put on the burden and on the plates of educators over time. And so one standard that I think is extremely important when it comes to partnerships, both public and private, but specifically private, is looking at a standard of what is a duplication of service. And that is something that we in Fargo Public Schools have focused on a lot, because we know that as educators, we have a responsibility to make sure that we're providing a guaranteed and viable curriculum that's aligned to our state standards for what our students are known and able to do. When it comes to other areas that schools need to address, because we serve students for such a large portion of the day, 5 days a week, we also have to recognize that we don't have the capacity or the resources that some of our private partners do. So if it's not a duplication of services, creating avenues for allowing them to provide those opportunities for students. As we continue to work towards making sure that every learner has an opportunity to succeed down the road, we are going to have to break the continuum and the institutional mindset that education is linear, and the fact that you have to go through K-12, then go through a four-year institution, and then find an employment. We know that success is defined far beyond that students have the ability to graduate high school with an associate degree. They have the ability to go straight into employment and then work their way to provide for a college if that's something that they choose to do, or they can go straight into an employment industry and have upward mobility now, because those options do exist. But in order to be able to do that, we have to be able to respect our partners in the private industry to come in and share their expertise and what their needs are to be able to provide those opportunities for our students. We are all a product of our experiences, and you alluded to Fargo being more urban in North Dakota, but we're a very rural state, right? And I spent over a decade of my career in Houston, Texas. So to me, even Fargo is more of a rural situation, even though in the state of North Dakota, we're more of an urban situation. And what I've learned through my experiences, I came to education through the Teach for America program. And prior to taking the superintendent role in Fargo, my job or my employment has always been in full title districts that have 95+% students coming out of poverty or representing marginalized populations. So coming to Fargo, North Dakota, I did, because we have about a 72% Caucasian population, we have about 30% free and reduced lunch rate. I had a sense of guilt that am I not doing the work they did? But my perspective shifted when I recognized that equity and making sure that we're providing all learners with an opportunity to succeed doesn't mean that you're just trying to be a voice for those that don't have equal access. There's also a responsibility that you use the privilege and the affluence that you may have in your community to teach that community, this is how we make sure that we're not leaving others behind. And the work needs to really happen from both ends, because we can't segregate a disadvantaged community with a community that has privilege and affluence. They need to be working together to making sure that we're sharing those resources. So the same goes with our partnerships. If you are geographically located near a school system or a school system that has the ability to have more resources than a rural school district, I do think that you have a responsibility to somehow share those resources or provide a set of services for those districts that you can't. Because at the end of the day, if we were really focused on our mission, which is educating all students to succeed, we have to focus on all the letters of all, and that's critically important.
I'll only add, Julia, that you started your question focused on business, and let me come back there to say, business can be a critical ally, both at the local, state, and state and even national level, in terms of bringing about educational transformation. And we don't have to look any further than the movement after the Nation at Risk report and the recent movement in standards-based education that brought some improvements, but it also had some limits. And so I think that we all have to be mindful of reaching out to the business community as key partners in rural as well as urban communities, because many of them have become alienated through all of our controversies in education and have kept at arm's length because they didn't want to get into fights about testing or charter schools or whole language and phonics and whatever it might be. So re-engaging the business community, I think, is an important part of what we have to do. They're influential leaders. They're not the only leaders. They aren't the only people we should be listening to, but they're critical partners that ought to be part of re-envisioning, creating a new normal, bringing about in this moment transformational changes to the way in which we see our work in developing children so that they can be citizens and workers and heads of families and lifelong learners. And business can play an important role in helping schools, in taking the burden off schools entirely and making the point that this is the business of the whole community.
Thank you for that, and such a great reminder, and really important to think about as people are moving forward in this work. So we have just about 10 minutes left, and so want to kind of wrap up with one kind of closing question for each of you. And kind of as we're looking forward, as we're hopefully coming out of this pandemic, or adjusting into whatever our new normal is going to be, we have a number of policymakers on the call, and in your roles and your positionality and kind of what your interactions look like on a day-to-day basis as you're thinking about this work of community partnerships and making sure that students have all of the needs that they need, what would you recommend to policymakers at any level as really that most important thing that you want them to consider, that you want them to drive forward? And so I would love to start with Superintendent Gandhi on this one, and then go to Superintendent Artson, and then end with Paul. And just looking forward to your thoughts on this one.
I think my biggest advice would be to focus on sustainability and concentrating your resources on your biggest asset, which is your human capital. I know this is true for Fargo Public Schools and probably all 175 plus school districts in the state of North Dakota, that as a public entity where our revenues are based off our local, state, and federal sources from taxes and everything else, over 80% of our budget is focused on salaries and benefits. So we know that that's where we're going to get the biggest bang for our buck, but we also have to figure out what's sustainable for us. So we have been very intentional with the usage of ESSER funds that we've received to address learning loss and the pandemic over the past couple of years, to not only focus on just intervention positions and everything else that we need to catch students up, but we've actually invested a significant amount on teacher coaches, because we know that when these dollars run out and we can no longer afford these positions in the district, we're going to have something to show for, and we can't create a crutch or a dependency for our system to have improved outcomes. We have to use these positions to coach our existing staff and our teachers and building them up. So that's a more sustainable model down the road. So to me, focusing on sustainability and your human capital and continuing to invest in those individuals is going to be the biggest asset and the biggest return of dividends that you'll receive.
Thank you, Superintendent Gandhi. That's very important from a teacher's aspect. I appreciate the support. Teacher is closest to the student. From a state perspective, where the accountability goes to the local, as well as I'm sandwiched between the federal government, to encourage policymakers to remove barriers. If there's one thing we realized from the pandemic, and what we learned from the pandemic, is that barrier of connectivity, the barrier of normal. There were too many that were in front of us. So I think flexibility is what I would like to have policymakers look more at. Remove those barriers, have more understanding of what can happen rather than what we can't do. We should be able to be focusing on more successes rather than making sure that we have all the I's dotted and the T's crossed. We need to make sure that there's more understanding of what innovation can happen and allow that to happen. And I know this whole is a discussion on equity. I'd like to put it more on equal opportunities. I'd also like to say that there were learning opportunities that may have been lost, but there were also tremendous gains. And I know in a digital world, moving forward, as I said, creating teachers, creating that learning environment for that next generation is incumbent upon us as leaders at this point. I wish we all had a crystal ball. It would be so easy to walk through that door and recognize that future. But we have to take those risks to get there. I would also encourage our policymakers to take those risks, full well knowing that they are calculated, that they are measured, but also to understand that those risks have great gains, and they are the gains for our future, for our students, for our families, and to maintain social emotional health for our communities all across my great state of Montana, as well as the great states that we have in our nation.
Well, Julia, I'll just wrap up by saying, I think we should be very cautious to avoid the tendency to define success in this era as going back to the old normal.
Yes.
The old normal didn't work very well for many of our students. It worked well for some, but overall, we had a lot of improvements that we needed to make before COVID came along. I think what we should do is what many of us are doing in our personal lives, sort of examine what was going well, what did you like doing, what was gratifying before the pandemic, and keep that. What wasn't, try and discard as much of that as you can. And likewise, in our adaptations to the pandemic, what did we do well? What new capacities did we develop? Let's keep them. And what problems came up with our adaptations? Let's try and put those in the rearview mirror. So we need to rethink the problem we're trying to solve. It's not just, the academic problems that we traditionally think about in the school sector, although those are important. The problem is overall preparing young people for success. The whole child, the whole community needs to come to work on that. So that's number one. It's a new normal. It's a better normal. It's a transformed normal. Number two is what I talked about earlier, and we've all been talking about at some level, is restoring trust. I mean, the fragmentation that we have going on in our society right now puts the education sector at risk. It puts our democracy at risk. And schools schools are inevitably going to reflect that, but schools can play a role in changing that and in focusing in on building relationships, on personalizing, on connecting people with one another, and to do the meaningful work of helping to rear our children, to build understanding, to build empathy. Those are things that I think as we do our work, we shouldn't just think of it as technical. We've got to think of it humanistically, interpersonally, and in terms of what it is doing overall for our society, in terms of strengthening bonds that tie us to one another rather than fragment us.
Thank you so much, Paul. I really honestly can't think of a better way to end our discussion than that. So thank you so much. I really appreciate it. And Superintendent Arnson, Superintendent Gandhi, thank you as well. Thank you to all three of you. This was such a great conversation and something that I know all three of you are really passionate about. So I really appreciate you taking the time to come speak with us about it today. So unfortunately, we're coming up on time. So once again, just want to thank all of you who are here and to our panelists and everyone who has helped to make this webinar happen for just such a great discussion and for being here. So just a couple quick housekeeping notes before we wrap up. You can see here a list of some of our upcoming webinars here at the Hunt Institute. We have our Race and Education series. We have 2 of those left in the month of October. So please feel free to sign up for those 2. And then we have a post-secondary pathways webinar coming up on November 4th on remedying college readiness. So please feel free to register for those. You can find the links at the Hunt Institute website. Also, the next Homeroom webinar will be November 9th. You can see here, we'll be talking about school infrastructure. And we'll have Mary Filardo, who is from the 21st Century School Fund, Aletta Garrett-Fitzgerald from the Children's Defense Fund, and Dr. James Lane, who is the State Superintendent for the state of Virginia, or excuse me, the Commonwealth of Virginia, if in case there's any Virginians on here. I don't want to get in trouble. So please feel free to register for that as well. We'll be on our Hunt Institute website, and we would love to see you there. With that in mind, thank you again. Feel free to reach out to any of us at the Hunt Institute if you have any questions, and we're happy to support you however we can. Thank you and have a great weekend.